action. I can't get no call to action, but I try and I try.
This year marks 5 years of call to action, and I know who cares. Well, not many people, perhaps, and rightly so, but to celebrate half a decade of our little show with a big voice, we're re-releasing a choice cut of some of our biggest and best episodes. Back in 2021, baited by a Bedouin birthing blanket, we caught fame-peddling, best-selling author Paul Feldwick. The man behind one of my favourite campaigns of all time, Rowan Atkinson's Barclaycard ads, Paul worked at the legendary agency BMP on some of Britain's most famous brands for over 30 years. We spoke to Paul not long after the release of his second book, Why Does the Peddler Sing?, where he explores why selling and entertainment go hand in hand. It was described by Rory Sutherland as possibly the book I would most highly recommend to anyone in marketing. So, what can you learn from this episode? Well, Paul discusses why we should focus on creating ads that entertain and engage their audience, the power of fame in building successful brands, the importance of listening to real consumers to inform your advertising, why we need to overcome the notion that creative thinking is unserious, the morality of advertising, and why we should create ads that provide value and enjoyment to the audience, and a treasure trove more. So feel better about marketing with episode 74 of Call to Action with Paul Feldwick. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you very much, Giles. Yes, I recognise most of that.
Good stuff. Right, 7 quick fire questions, Paul. Mac or PC?
PC, although, years ago we did have one of the very first Macintoshes, which was a lot of fun, and the kids grew up playing Shuffle Puck Cafe and Kid Picks on it. So, could be either.
Could be either. Okay, number 2, rational or irrational?
Has to be irrational.
Mental availability or fame?
Fame.
Right, we're getting to my favourite ad territory now. Richard Latham or Johnny English?
I have a soft spot for Richard Latham.
Good stuff.
The original.
Sticking with those ads then, rug or snakebite?
Oh, rug.
Yeah, or Bedouin birthing blanket, we should probably say.
Yes.
Two more. P.T. Barnum or Elon Musk?
P.T. Barnum, although they have a lot in common.
Good stuff. And finally, famous clowns, Ronald McDonald or Krusty the Clown?
I think Krusty the Clown.
Perfect. Okay, brilliant. Paul, thank you again for joining us. We always start the show by exploring and often enjoying the sometimes linear and not so linear routes that guests have taken in their careers. So you famously worked at the legendary BMP, as I mentioned in the intro, which then became DDB for 30 years, working on everything from PG Tips chimpanzees to the great Rowan Atkinson ads I referenced there too, the Sugar Puffs Honey Monster and tons more iconic British ads. But what was your first ever job? And then how did that lead to your first proper agency job?
Well, I suppose BMP was actually my first proper job because I went there straight from university. If you want anything before that, it's kind of hot picking in the summer or working behind the bar at the Fountain, New Malden, or stuff like that, which was interesting, but not very.
Was it a very intentional and deliberate move then to go straight into Adland?
Well, let me just say it was intentional only in the sense that I thought I must get a job. It's my last year at university and I ought to get a job because I don't know what I'll do otherwise. Although I had vague fantasies of staying at university and doing postgraduate work because I quite liked the collegiate atmosphere. And everybody at that time was applying for advertising. It was very hot in 1974. Everybody wanted to work in advertising. It seemed to be intensely competitive. And many of my friends were preparing CVs and sending them off to dozens of agencies and really working hard at it and getting lots of rejections. I rather half-heartedly got the address of Boase Pollitt from the Oxford Appointments Bureau, this is the sort of employment agency bit, and wrote off to them. Much to my surprise, I got an interview, and then I got another interview. And then Stanley Pollitt said, I'm going to proposition you, would you like a job? So I thought, well, this may not happen again, so I better say yes. So I did. So I kind of fell into it, like so many people say they do. The interesting thing, perhaps, from the point of view of your question is my first job was I was actually hired as an account manager. And the irony is that not only did I not really want to apply for the job of account planner, because it sounded very sort of technical and nerdy the way they described it, but actually I wasn't even allowed to, because David Cowan at that time would only consider taking on trainees for planning who had A levels in maths. And I didn't. So I kind of got in through the back door, because I managed to sell myself somehow to them as an account manager. And after about 6 months, I think they and I had discovered that I was probably the world's worst account manager. I was very much literally on the point of being fired. And then some hunch made Stanley say to me, I don't think this has been a great success, but perhaps before we get rid of you, perhaps you'd like to try account planning instead. So I did. And the extraordinary thing was that I instantly clicked with that job and found I could contribute straight away. And, well, the rest, I suppose, is history, as they say.
It's funny you say that you think you were the world's worst account manager, because actually we've had a few guests claim that title previously, who have then subsequently sidestepped into other roles, whether it was...
Well, there's a lot of competition for the title of world's worst account manager, and I've worked with many of them too. But
Did you enjoy anything about the role, or was that a silly question?
I think I was out of my depth. It didn't really suit my strengths at all, as I'd kind of imagined to myself that it would, but I didn't really live up to my fantasy. I mean, I think what I enjoyed about it was I loved being in the agency environment, which was still a great deal of fun in 1974. It was a whole new world to me, coming from a pretty humble background, that, we were able to sort of, people drove fast cars and had lunch in nice restaurants, and it was generally, all very glamorous and exciting. And I was a very callow youth, so I was learning a lot, even though I was mainly learning from my mistakes.
Yeah, which is a good way to learn, I think.
Mm.
And was the planning then, was the role and was the department quite as nerdy as it once sounded?
No, not at all. I mean, I hadn't really sort of pictured quite what it was. It just sort of sounded like you needed maths. It was going to be a lot of number crunching. And there were numbers involved. And actually what I discovered, again, to my pleasure, was with a little bit of application and hard thought, I discovered that I was basically very numerate. And, advanced statistics were not required. But what was required, absolutely, was the ability to look at a page of numbers and make sense of them. And I discovered I had that, and I've always had that. And I am distressed by the fact that actually very many people seem not to have that, honestly, which is annoys me very much. But that was, I guess, one of the things I learned about myself. At that time, we did have access to lots of data. It was very different from today. We had Nielsen, we had panel data, we had all sorts of quantitative data, and we were able to commission quantitative surveys and things. So I mean, I got a very good grounding in the basics of market research. I learned about sampling and questionnaire design and all that sort of thing. But we also did a tremendous amount of qualitative research at that time. And it was one of BMP's sort of characteristic things. I think the planners did a huge amount of qualitative research themselves. So a large part of a planner's life was spent driving up and down the M1 to Sheffield or Leeds, doing evening groups with real consumers,
Real people.
who would tell you what they thought of the ads. And there is no better grounding in understanding advertising than sitting regularly in front of rooms full of people, showing them ads or talking about ads with them and understanding how they respond. If they all sit there in stony silence and say, I don't know what all that was about, it's very hard to retain much enthusiasm for it, however much the creative director might think it's wonderful. And conversely, if they all fall about laughing and say, oh, yes, I'd like to see more of that, then you think, well, maybe we're onto something here. It's not exactly rocket science, but
no, but sadly, it does need saying, doesn't it?
Grounding for working in advertising.
You said it was a good grounding, but equally, there's no better measure really than either. And as to your point, it's not rocket science, and yet you would believe it was rocket science the way that some of the the work gets done and the way that agencies operate nowadays. In my experience, at least, the amounts of times people skip even the most basic research processes is quite alarming.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And presumably then, did you, from travelling up and down the M1 so frequently and talking to real people, is that where you started to observe or appreciate the link between groups of people, communities, cultures, and advertising?
It's an interesting thing. And I mean, I reflect on it in Why Does the Peddler Sing? But I think at one level, it was very, very clear to us all working at BNP that there were very, very powerful connections between being entertaining in advertising and being effective. But the interesting thing was that we didn't talk about that very much. And I don't think we really had a theory of why it was important or how it fitted. So we were kind of in this situation of doing one thing, but talking as if we were doing another. So we would still talk as if it was about communicating a proposition or a message or a strategy or something very abstract like that. And yet we also behaved in practice on the basis that, if people were going to like it and it was going to be popular, then, it was going to be a good ad. And if people didn't like it, it probably wasn't going to be a good ad. We didn't believe you could bore people. I suppose the closest we came to formulating it, and again, I've quoted this before or paraphrased Martin Boase before, but Martin Boase, of course, the B of Boase Massimi Pollitt, he used to say something to us quite often like, we believe at this agency that if you're going to invite yourself into somebody's living room for 30 seconds, then you have a sort of moral duty not to shout at them or bore them or insult them. But if you put a smile on their faces, if you entertain them, or at least tell them something that's interesting to them, if you're a charming guest, then they might like you a bit more. And if they like you a bit more, they might be more inclined to buy your brand. And that didn't really fit with any of the conventional theories of advertising that were embodied in the way advertising was briefed or the way advertising was researched, or any of the sort of the theory that one came across insofar as it existed, which was all about, you have to communicate the consumer benefit or whatever it is. And yet I think it was incredibly profound. And I mean, I suppose both my books have been, in a way, sort of lengthy reflections on that point of view as expressed by Martin, because I think it is that, at bottom, advertising that builds brands does so not so much by communicating rational benefits, although that may come into it, but at a much more fundamental level, it works by creating relationships. And through creating relationships, it also creates fame. And I think both those things are the sort of the central concepts that we need to work on in order to understand how to build and how to maintain brands. And I think more and more people are beginning to realize that, or other people have come to very similar conclusions through their own reflections. I mean, Bob Hoffman, who you mentioned earlier when we were speaking just before we started, is one, for example, and he's beautifully articulate about this and much more pithy sometimes than I usually am. So I think people like Orlando Wood at System One, of course, are coming to those conclusions, and Byron Sharp and Ehrenberg Bass people have for a long time been saying, all advertising really does is it raises mental availability, and that's a very closely allied concept. So I think more and more people are beginning to see this, and it's actually quite hard to argue with when it comes down to it. The biggest brands tend to be the most famous brands. It's quite hard to find exceptions to that as a general rule. And there are many ways of creating fame, but one way of creating fame is through advertising, in the sense of particularly using paid media. That's because one of the essential ingredients for creating fame is that you have to reach very large numbers of people and make them interested in what you have to show. It's no good being a wonderful ad or a wonderful singer or a wonderful movie or a wonderful anything else if it only ever goes to a relatively small number of people. It has to be exposed on a massive basis. That's the principle on which show business has always worked, and even more so today works with the concept of the blockbuster and the big bet. You have to go out there and be known to lots of people. It is a numbers game at the end of the day.
A couple of weeks ago in Bob Hoffman's newsletter, there was a beautiful line which you mentioned. He's quite pithy, and you're absolutely right. And he said that it's hard to get famous in private.
Exactly. Yes.
So that just reminded me of. But equally, going back, I mean, you made so many good points there. Going back to your quote about Martin and coming into people's living rooms, there's a Disney quote, and I'm probably gonna get it wrong, but the essence of it was Disney would rather try to entertain people and hope the audience learns something than the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Disney's a phenomenon. I don't really have much to say about Disney in my books, but I could have done. And if I write another one, I may well do. I think the whole history of Disney and right up to the present day as an organization is sort of remarkably demonstrates the connections between entertainment and commerce. And of course, there are many ways in which those two things are linked. The one obvious one, in a way, being that entertainment itself is a business. It is a product that is being sold. So the first thing that you want to do if you come up with a movie is you want to make that movie a financial success. But then there are plenty of other ways that you can build on that and make it into much more of a success. Disney was a great pioneer of that, because right from his very first animated full-length feature, a thing that had never been done before, which was Snow White back in the 30s, even before that film came out, he had in his mind perfectly clear the extent to which he was going to sell merchandise based around that movie. So, all sorts of things, the Snow White dolls and the seven dwarfs and the games and the books and the gramophone records and everything else, all of that is not just a way of helping to monetize the movie, although it does that very successfully, but it also spreads the fame of that movie, and it also enables the public to engage with that movie and own something that is a part of it, interact with it. You do not just passively sit and watch Snow White the movie once in a while when you go to the cinema, which in those days was all you could ever do, your children have all the Snow White toys and the Snow White dolls to play with at home on an ongoing basis. And their friends will see them, and they'll talk about them between them. And that's how, I mean, it's obvious when you think about it, but I don't think people in advertising sort of articulate this very much because their discourse tends to be on a completely different plane. It's totally dominated by a long history of, stuff about consumer benefits and sales messages and rational persuasion, which is important in certain aspects of advertising, but is actually not what building a great brand or a great franchise like Disney or James Bond, it is really about at all.
No, and testament to the success of Disney, as you know, I believe we took our two young daughters to see Frozen, the musical, 3 or 4 days ago. And I know that, commercially, what that bloody took, what those tickets cost, but equally in testament to Snow White happens to be one of their favourite Disney films as well. And the two kind of franchises of Snow White and Frozen are coming up to 100-year gap between the two.
That is extraordinary, isn't it? But I mean, one of Disney's skills has always been knowing how to work that back catalogue. That has just evolved over the decades as the technology has evolved. I mean, I can remember when, before DVDs, when video cassettes were relatively new, Disney were very, very skillful at bringing out films from their back catalogue onto video cassette. And they'd only do 1 or 2 a year, so that every year, and they'd not been available before. I mean, one has to think this is not so very long ago. But, we have to remind ourselves today that there was a time when, things were not all instantly universally available via streaming or whatever. That prior to the invention of the domestic video cassette player, which only really becomes a thing, I suppose, in the 80s. Prior to that, if you wanted to see a film like Snow White, there was only one way you could see it. You'd have to go to a cinema that was showing Snow White, and that was unlikely to be happening. So the invention of the video cassette was an enormous opportunity for Disney to sort of reinvent their whole back catalogue. And they did it in a brilliant way because this is the era when my sons were growing up. And every year it was like 1 or 2 new ones would come on stream. 1 year it would be Pinocchio, 1 year it would be Dumbo, 1 year it would be Sleeping Beauty. They'd be re-released in the cinema, but they'd also come out on the video cassette. And we'd buy them as they came out and sort of collect them almost. So, I mean, the more you think about Disney, the more you think they've put a foot wrong once or twice historically, but on the whole, that organization has a brilliant record of, using its assets and its history. And I think there's a moral there for brands as well, because, a lot of famous brands are very old and they have equally long histories. Disney, of course, being a brand in itself. But it also shows you that it's the importance of the assets that you've had in the past that you can go on reusing and reusing and reusing as long as you find ways to make them new and keep them fresh. Disney did not kind of go, oh, Snow White, nobody wants to see that anymore, or that's just a purely historical interest. They would say, Snow White is as good a product as anything we've done, and it's as relevant today as anything we've done. And they will continue to use it. And everything, as you say, Snow White to Frozen and everything in between.
Yeah. No, very good points. Absolutely. You mentioned there, I think you said that people today in our industry are perhaps not very good at articulating that link between entertainment and fame building and brand and advertising. I wonder, how much is it that versus how much is it that it's not very easy to talk about it or demonstrate? Because I have to sometimes stop myself from quoting the great Jeremy Bullmore, because I'll do it all day if you let me. But he wrote in his wonderful Posh Spice and Purcell talk in 2001, I don't know why it is, I only know that it is, when referencing fame and some of the things that go into brand and success.
Jeremy was one of those people who not only says things sort of with much more economy than I ever could, but I generally found said them a long time earlier than I did as well. But, people, he was a pioneer in that sense. Posh Spice and Purcell is 20 years old now. But I don't know, how people really responded to that talk when it came out. I think Jeremy had this wonderful way, or still does, I hope, have this wonderful way of sort of saying things that are sort of interesting, provocative. Oh, I never thought of it like that. But are often sort of, they're so new to people that I think they just kind of go, that's interesting, but that's a sort of slightly whimsical point of view. It's not really telling me how to do my job. Actually, I mean, what he's saying in Posh Spice and Purcell is absolutely rock solid. How to do your job. It says, if you want to be a successful brand, the most important thing is to make your brand famous. And, my recent book is partly about why is that so, but also it's a lot about why does that seem, on the one hand, an obvious thought, but also it's not a thought that has been really articulated through the history of advertising. Part of the story behind that, it's a long and, I think, fascinating story, is that right from the very early days of advertising agencies as we would recognize them, and I date it specifically from about 1900, there was this great move to professionalization in advertising. And advertising agencies wanted, above all, to distance themselves from the sort of 19th century world of P.T. Barnum and the traveling medicine show, and all the bad practices that went along with that. And they didn't want to be seen as hucksters or traveling entertainers. They literally wanted to be seen as professionals, like doctors or lawyers. Someone like, Calkins, for example, great copywriter of the early 20th century, literally wrote a lot about how he aspired to teach advertising as if it were a profession like doctors or lawyers. And so they distanced themselves from that history. And it's sort of understandable why they did. But it was also, I think, set them off in a sort of bizarrely strange and different direction from what their real antecedents were. And I think it's that refusal to acknowledge that advertising has its roots, in a very sort of, popular culture, if you like, and to pretend that it's this much higher calling of selling through rational persuasion. And that has been reinvented by generation after generation of advertising practitioners. And it's led us into some weird places. And I think it's been a huge distraction and a huge confusion. Again, I mean, it's a long story, and I've tried to sort of tell the story in Why Does the Peddler Sing? So I do urge anyone who's intrigued by what I'm trying to say here to go and read it. It would take me far too long to go through that whole story as we're talking this afternoon. But it's not just that today's advertising people have odd ideas about advertising. There's a whole history going back 120 years of advertising agencies trying to pretend they're doing one thing, even when they were actually, in many cases, very good at doing something completely different.
I mentioned on a recent episode, in fact, that I've got a lot of friends who work in the kind of more arts and culture type industries, and I'm sure most of them think I sit in a room nowadays and just press different buttons that all say evil on them. such is the reputation of advertising and the intrusive nature of the data capture. But maybe we do need to go back more to the day of peddlers singing and more clown-like approach to our craft.
Yes, I mean, I think at the end of the day, that raises a number of big, complicated questions about the morality of what we do, which is always an old chestnut and to which there is never an entirely satisfactory answer. Although the reality is that, it's a potentially powerful tool that can be used in the service of things that may be good, may be less good, may even be evil. So, it is in that sense, it's kind of morally neutral. But I think there is also, and I go back to Martin Boase's quote here, that his view about why you should make advertising entertaining was not just that it will work, but also that there was a kind of ethical point behind it. And I think it bears repeating that if you are going to inflict lots of advertising on people, and your goal is to put it in front of them as much as possible, I think there is not just a practical argument, but there's also an ethical argument that says, let's try and produce something that gives them some kind of pleasure or satisfaction, so that experience for them is not an entirely awful one. And today it is very often a pretty awful one. When advertising is only interested in being interruptive, being hard to avoid, being in your face, it doesn't create a relationship that makes you want to buy that brand. And also, I think, another huge red herring, which again, I don't want to go down that wormhole today, and others have said a lot about it, the whole stuff about purpose today. But I think if advertising agencies really wanted to say, we have a purpose, we have a sort of ethical purpose, they could start pretty close to home by saying our ethical purpose in agencies is not to irritate the hell out of people, but perhaps to put a smile on their faces. And that is not an easy thing to do, but it's possible to do. It's certainly possible to aspire to doing it. If you look back over the last 50 years, you can trace, and there is data that shows that up to and peaking in 1991, there's some evidence that people were more and more inclined to think that advertising might be better than the programs, as it was put. It was quite entertaining. That actually peaks in 1991, and it starts to decline, and it declines through the 90s, and it's declined ever since. And there's some other data that I was reading just recently that shows that in the last 20 years, the number of people saying advertising is basically very, very annoying has gone up a lot in the last 20 years too. So these are totally consistent. I think what we're seeing is not only have agencies sort of stopped thinking it important that the public should enjoy their advertising, but actually they are in serious danger of forgetting how to do it. Even when they say they want to do it now, they sort of fail. And I guess this takes me right back to my early trips up the M1. That literally that there is no better touchstone than find some real people if you can nowadays, whatever that involves. And in many ways, it might be much easier because I imagine you could do a great deal of it online, even if not all of it. And genuinely ask them what they think of your ads, and genuinely listen. And don't then dismiss them as, just an ignorant bunch of oiks or housewives who don't appreciate good advertising, because those are actually the people that you're trying to appeal to. Ask yourself why Mrs. Brown's Boys is the best-selling Christmas DVD. Even though probably everybody who works in advertising thinks it's the most god-awful trash and politically incorrect to boot. There is a real world out there outside the charmed village of advertising. where people are still sort of enjoying a good laugh at some basically pretty traditional types of entertainment. And if those are done well, then they become successful.
Middle England, as Steve Harrison referred to it as. You're absolutely right.
Time, weather, and...
We interrupt this podcast to announce that we will never interrupt this podcast with ads. Ads that awkwardly nudge you to contact the pod's host, Giles Edwards, at giles@gasp.agency. Only recently, some pod listening companies did just that, calling for guidance on direct mail and client retention. But we're definitely not asking you to do that. Anyway, back to the show.
전투적 공허와 감사의 인사를 보냅니다.
Well, I'm Kim Marsh than Kim Jong-un anyway.
I certainly encourage everybody listening to go out and buy and read Why Does the Peddler Sing, even if they've already bought and read it already, because it's wonderful. We will link to that in this episode too, Paul. I'm mindful of time because we've got quite a few listener questions to get through, and I can see the time creeping already. So can I put a couple of my listener questions to you?
Please do.
So asking the general public for their opinion, be it on Brexit or boat names, is notoriously fraught with danger. We've actually got three, but I'm going to sneak one into our final posers. So question one is from Jake Sanders, aka POS Marketer on Twitter. And Jake asks, why is creative thinking in advertising considered, quote, unserious? And how do we reverse this? Also, do you have any tips on overcoming shame to get fame? So I guess he's anticipating part of the answer there.
Overcoming shame. Yeah, I think I can sort of see what he's getting at there. I mean, I think there's the word creative and the words creativity, I think, have become very loaded in very strange ways. I mean, the word creativity didn't really exist until about the 1960s. In fact, as David Ogilvy pointed out, even as late as the 1980s, you couldn't find it in the Oxford English Dictionary. So it's a bit of a sort of neologism. And I think it only started to be bandied around in advertising around the time of sort of Bill Bernbach's rise to fame and the other agencies that followed on in the wake of Bill Bernbach, Caper Koenig, Goliath, Carl Alley, and then, and so on. And I think that there's a really interesting thing happened in advertising about that point, which was where the advertising industry started to conceive of a kind of creativity that was cool, and it suddenly thought, oh, we don't have to do that crap old advertising anymore, even though that crap old advertising was actually, in many cases, was what was popular, was what the public liked, and was what built the big brands. No, they wanted to do cool, hip stuff that was going to appeal to their friends in Manhattan or San Francisco or whatever. And so that was where creativity in advertising started to mean not just what will be popular and entertaining, but, what will be acceptable within the advertising community. And I think that what people are ashamed of now in advertising is doing stuff that is popular. And that's a terrible place to be. John Webster was never ashamed of being popular. I mean, this is, of course, the great creative director at BMP, who was, not the only great creative person that we had there, but responsible for a great many of BMP's most famous campaigns. And John Webster was a kind of a fairly modest man from a fairly ordinary background who was genuinely motivated by producing work that was popular. He wanted work that people were going to talk about in the pub, talk about in the playground, talk about in the supermarket. He didn't hobnob that much with the advertising village, but he had a bunch of really close friends who were nothing to do with advertising, who he'd go and sort of spend Friday nights with each week in the pub. And I think they were his sort of touchstone for the real world, if you like. And And of course, he made active use of the qualitative research that we were doing. Unlike most creative people, he didn't see that as a threat. He absolutely welcomed it. And that's because his motivation was he wanted to produce popular work. Now, if you don't want to produce popular work, I think you're in a very strange position right from the start if your job is writing advertising. And I knew it had started to go wrong when somebody reported a conversation they had with the creative director of what was then BMPDDB, probably sometime in the early 2000s, when he said, oh, well, you know, that stuff that Webster did, it was all very well in its day, but it was all a bit populist, wasn't it? I mean, if people in advertising take that attitude, and I think, to be honest, far too many of them do, you know, their idea of a good film is, oh, we'll get this really good director, and, you know, we'll make it look like a Wes Anderson movie, and, you know, this is a blah, blah. Occasionally it's interesting. To be honest, most of the time it's extremely boring. But even when it's interesting, it's not popular because they lack all the skills that are required to produce popular work. So I think, the shame and fame, an interesting sort of choice of words there. Of course, if you are totally without shame, you can be, I suppose, ultimately a bit of a psychopath. But I think the thing that people in advertising agencies ought to be ashamed of is betraying their clients by producing work that is not effective. And they ought to be ashamed of being out of touch with the public that they're trying to appeal to. And that's where the shame ought to be placed.
That's a great answer. I think one of the victims of that want to be cool and create cool work, maybe by friendly fire, is just the good, honest jingle, which we're in the process of building one for our client right now. And it feels almost like we're cheating because it's just so obvious. And yet I think maybe that's an area where, for some reason, shame is attached. Question 2 then, Paul, is from Will Poskett. Now, Will's added quite a bit of context before he gets to the question, so let me just race through this. We know from the brilliant work of Binet and Field that fame is the best driver of long-term brand growth. Other studies also indicate that likability is a good driver of success too. Yet too often I have seen brands try to boost the latter, liking, and the determinant of the former, fame. I have seen clients round off the edges, make something nice but with less fame potential. So my question would be, given the choice, would you rather have an ad that is famous and divisive or something likable but less fame-worthy?
There's sort of kind of debate that is sort of in danger of, I can sort of see where he's coming from, but we can end up sort of in one of those sort of scholastic discussions where, you know, one has to sort of argue about the meaning of every word in that formula before we can have the conversation. It's worth saying, for example, that I admire Les and Peter's work very much, and I lean on it tremendously to sort of give some substance to what I'm saying as well. So we're very substantially in agreement. It's worth saying that I think they use the word fame in a slightly different sense from the way I use it. I use it in a fairly sort of broad, general sense. I think they use it in a rather more specific sense because they kind of operationalize it as a particular characteristic of certain campaigns. What they mean by it is a campaign that is talked about, that gets a lot of buzz, that gets a lot of word of mouth. And they point out, I think, not surprisingly and quite rightly, that campaigns that achieve that are more successful than those that don't. Now, for me, the ability of anything to be talked about and shared it's a kind of a measure of fame, but it's only one aspect of fame. I mean, it is an essential aspect of fame in the sense that, you know, you don't become famous unless people are prepared to talk about you and share. or there's a different level of fame if it's simply known to lots of people, but they're just absorbing it passively. So being talked about, being shared is really important. Being argued about may well be an aspect of that. So I think to be divisive and to be controversial is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, in each case, you have to take some judgment sometimes as to whether it's going to tip over into being, alienating too many people or creating other problems that you don't want to live with. But on the whole, it's good, and even when people really, really dislike you, you will maintain your fame if you do the other things that are necessary to maintaining fame. So, one keeps sort of coming back to the dreadful figure of Donald Trump in this, which makes my point that, fame is morally neutral. But of course, we also need to remember that about half the population of the United States think Donald Trump is a jolly fine guy and would make a jolly fine president again. So, let's not be totally confined by our metropolitan bubble view of the reality. But, if you take Trump as an example, he has, he's a polarizing guy, extremely polarizing guy. But actually, his opponents do as much to maintain his fame and therefore his power as his supporters do. And fame is a source of power. It's not innocent. I suppose, I don't really go into these sort of moral debates, but fame is fame is a source of power that can be used for good or ill. So, simply saying, let's have a lot of fame and it will all be wonderful is not necessarily going to save the world. But it is saying, actually, if you want to have power in the world, if you want to have power to change things in the world, without fame, you're not going to be able to do it. So I don't know if that's answered the question, but I think what I'm saying, the drift of it is, I think I'd rather be talked about than not talked about. And I think likability is a slightly woolly thing that, could be dangerous if you start taking it too literally.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly very happy with that answer, because in the rare instances that people ask me to deliver one of my long rambling talks that I do, I have a slide of a parachute where I claim that advertising should be more like parachutes in as much as they work or they don't work. Nobody likes a parachute. But of course, some people do disagree with that. I think the real danger is indifference. I'd rather someone liked or hated it.
Yeah.
But I think you've added a lot more context there than I think I ever have. So thank you. So the final part of the interview is our 4 pertinent posers that we put to every guest, starting with, what advice would you give to your younger self?
My younger self? I'd actually say, hang on in there and enjoy it, because, you may be amazed to know that you'll still be interested in this stuff in 40 or 50 years' time.
Excellent. Number 2. So I'm going to switch number 2's question to a question that actually came from the listener question from Call to Action alumni, the brilliant ad therapist Gillian Rightford, because she said, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the industry as it is today, what would it be and why?
I would probably get rid of most of the people who work in creative departments and replace them with somebody else.
Are we allowed a quick why? Or can we guess?
Because I think with the best will in the world, they have all been so conditioned that they are unable to think outside the narrow tram lines of thinking like each other, of thinking that a good ad is one that wins awards, of believing all the sort of shite that's been peddled for 30 years by people like the Watford Ad School. I think they're a lost cause. I think you would do much better to get rid of all of them and get people who come from a background in something like entertainment.
Yes, amazing. I'm pleased I pushed you on that one. Number 3, are there any books that you would recommend? And we will, of course, recommend and link to both The Anatomy of Humbug and Why Does the Peddler Sing? But can you recommend any other books to our listeners?
Oh, wow. I mean, everybody must, of course, read Why Brands Grow and Jenny Romaniuk's book on distinctive brand assets. I mean, they're quite dry and technical, but they're solid. They're really important. And I think I see my books as very complementary to those. I'm not sure whether Byron or Jenny do, but I see my work as very complementary to theirs. I think anything on the history of advertising is worth reading. I mean, there's lots and lots of stuff. Reading histories of advertising is always enlightening. And I won't sort of proliferate titles on that. I think that's about it. But rather than fob you off with a long reading list.
Well, if you think of any more, do email them over and I'll get them added to this list because they'll all be linked to from the episode. Funny enough, we had Jenny Romanek on a few months ago and she was absolutely wonderful talking about distinctive brand assets and everything around and in between. So that was wonderful. And number 4 then, Paul, is we always dedicate every episode to somebody and we bestow or hospital pass that honour, depending on your view, to our guest who has to give their reason why. So would you kindly dedicate this episode?
Can it be somebody living or dead?
Either, absolutely.
I think, out of a number of possible candidates, I think I'd like to dedicate this episode to Martin Boase, actually. And I could have included Stanley and probably would include Stanley if I could include 2. But, I mean, Martin is still around to enjoy it if he ever hears about it. And also, I've talked about him so much in this interview. And I think, not just in terms of what he said, but more importantly, in terms of the advertising that his agency produced. I think he's been such an inspiration to me, quite apart from the fact that he was instrumental in giving me a job and was a fantastic employer for 30 years that I was there. So, yes, I'd like to dedicate it to Martin Boase.
Wonderful. Well, that's a fantastic recommendation. This episode is very proudly dedicated to Martin Boase. Thank you, Paul. As a final call to action, everyone can head over to the listing where we've got links pointing to Anatomy of Humbug, Why Does the Peddler Sing, How Brands Grow, Measuring Distinctive Brand Assets from Jenny Romanek. How else can our listeners get more Paul Feldwick?
I don't know, actually. I would mention that even if you've got the books are also both available as audio books. I may well be writing another one. I mean, I'm not traveling at the moment. I may well produce another book. I do have a website. If you can be bothered to find it, there are lots of links to things I've done, bits of video and articles I've written. So paulfeldwick.com, contains quite a lot of back catalogue if you want to search it out. And otherwise, I'm sort of quite active at the moment, writing the occasional piece, which I generally post on LinkedIn just because it's convenient. And some quite interesting discussions go on there about advertising at the moment. So each bar that, I guess.
Perfect. Well, we will include the link to your website. We'll also throw in, there's countless YouTube reels showing my favourite ads, which of course are the Barclaycard ads that you did with Rowan Atkinson. So we'll link to all of those as well so everyone can enjoy that. So Paul, thank you for joining us. I've stolen more time from you than I agreed to, so apologies for that, but it has been entirely my pleasure and an absolute privilege to talk. If you are one of the dozen T-thou-zillion who regularly lends us your ears, have tuned into any or all of our 138 episodes, are one of the over 500,000 listeners and downloaders, or have been lured or bullied into guesting, sent in a listener question, tuned in to hear the answer, recommended us, left a review, thought about leaving a review but haven't, or anything in between, we salute you. Thank you for supporting this little show with a big voice And in the meantime, seriously, leave a review on Apple and or Spotify if you have a moment. Thank you.